here's one taboo fact that you can get canceled on the left or anywhere in the mainstream for touching, and this is the kind of thing that Trump touches in his you know with all his bigoted topspin, but the fact that the left can't acknowledge that there's a kernel of truth in his utterances here is a problem, and that is just the disproportionate amount of violence in the black community upon the black community, right? So black on black violence is still terrible in the U.S. and largely accounts for our outlier status with respect to homicides. But the thing is especially invidious when you just look at the percentages of the population, because when you're talking about black on black crime or black on white crime, you're talking about mostly black men, right? It's not black women committing most of these murders. So you're talking about 6% of the population or thereabouts, right? 6% of the population commits something like 50% of the murders, right? Now uttering this sentence could get me canceled, but for the preparations I've made within my own life to not be cancelable, right? This is just a fact, however, but it's a fact that only African Americans can speak about without being destroyed. And so this is absolutely a time. I mean, so what white Democratic candidate for the presidency will speak honestly about this fact? It is the kind of thing that gets you immediately compared to Richard Spencer or some lunatic neo-Nazi, right? This is just a social problem, for whatever its causes, that we have to get a handle on, we as a society and the black community especially. And again, this is a problem which the black community in most respects suffers from exclusively. Again, almost all of these murders are of black members of the community by black young men. So you're talking about cities like Chicago, right, which have neighborhoods which are essentially war zones. And this was much worse everywhere in the 90s, but to the degree that the homicide rate is still intolerable in the U.S., it is largely explained by black on black violence in the inner cities. And again, it's like you just can't be a white guy talking about this, right? And here I am on your podcast doing it, but this is the kind of thing that you should be free to discuss. I mean, it's absolutely necessary to discuss this. People on the left will demand that. I mean, they know what the explanation has to be for this. It has to be on some level white racism or the legacy of white racism or racist policies or racist policing or racist economics or the war on drugs and the incarceration machinery that we've built. All of that has given us this problem, and the remedy has to be somehow combating racism as the first order of business.
Right. So let's not do that. I mean, what do you think it is?
Well, I'm not. I mean, all of them. I mean, the legacy effects of the war on drugs are still disastrous, and I mean that is a war that should never have been waged, and that is an education problem and a medical problem. It's not a incarceration problem. So we have to get out of that business. And those penalties have fallen, as we know, disproportionately on the black community and on the non-white community generally. But I mean, there's a conversation to be had about the limits of racism as an explanation for this problem, right? I mean, what we have at minimum we have a cultural problem that has to be solved, and only the black community can really solve it. I mean, this is something. It's like, and on some level, understanding the origins, even if we knew that the origin of the problem was white racism. We have slavery, we have Jim Crow, and then we have a direct, just line of falling dominoes to the problem of inner city violence, for black teenagers. Um, let's just say that was true. That still doesn't tell you what the remedy is now. I mean, how do you get people to live different lives now, and to value their lives differently? I mean, so this is the a third rail of political discourse for a reason, right? Because it's not easily uh, amenable to a socioeconomic analysis or any other analysis. I mean, you go into Latino areas in the same cities with the same socioeconomic characteristics, and you don't have the same level of violence, right? Um, so it's not. It's just you know, it's just something that's not being talked about. And to talk about it, if your skin is the wrong color, brands you as a bigot. And yet, my concern in talking about it is twofold. My concern is it would be really nice to have uh, fewer murders in this country, right? I mean, every time you hear about people getting shot, both those who die and those who live with injuries, I mean, that is just an awful, intolerable status quo to be, not changing. Um, and then there's just the larger issue of what the taboos around this conversation does to our political discourse. I mean, I view this as yet another reason why we have someone like Trump, because the people who support Trump know they're being lied to, right? I mean, in the run up to the election, we had this kind of hysteria around police violence and the shootings of young black men. Now, some of those cases were awful, right? Where it was clearly utter sadistic malpractice on the part of cops who belong in prison, right? But some were clearly legitimate shootings, and there was no will on the once you went left of center to speak honestly about the differences there, right? And as far as I can tell, there's still no political will.
But the nuanced discussions, I think, are definitely there.
But they're not there. They're not coming from presidential candidates, right? They're not coming from. I don't see them honestly in the New York Times, right? I mean, they might be happening on podcasts. I do it, and perhaps you do it, but. This is not this has to be the kind of thing that Pete Buttigieg could say at a debate and not reap a whirlwind of hate for, right? I mean, take another example here. Again, there's just there's so much low-hanging fruit here, but so I just mentioned Buttigieg. So Buttigieg is often asked why he has 0% black support, right?
Yeah.
And he responds like this is one of the great, mysteries of the universe that it would take a team of scholars and rabbis and Nobel laureates to penetrate, right? He has never once, maybe he's changed, but to my ear, he has never once uttered an honest sentence on this topic. And he pivots to blandishments like, well, they just haven't heard the message yet, or, I just got to get out there. But the reality is that the level of homophobia in the black community is off the charts, right? Because of, and this is, largely it has to do with the black church and the level of religiosity in that community. But, I mean, that's why he doesn't have black support. Is it important to talk about that? I don't know. I mean, it's just, but what is toxic here is there are all these truths hiding in plain sight that are going unacknowledged, right? And you can do a little bit of this. I mean, I'm not saying that we have to, nakedly broadcast the truth, at every opportunity, no matter the consequences. But there's so much obfuscation and lack of straightforwardness on the left that the counter reaction, to it has been growing for quite some time, and it's massively energizing the right. And that's what, as someone whose first political goal is to see to it that Trump doesn't get a second term, That's what I worry about. It's like if you can't speak honestly about facts that everyone can observe, or that it takes 5 minutes to surface, um, it's just what is the path here to not alienating a majority of people? Because it's not just a matter of not speaking honestly. It's castigating fully half of the society on many of these points as racists or sexists or misogynists or xenophobes. And I mean, again, to take another topic, immigration. Of course, it's possible to be concerned about immigration from a racist, white supremacist, xenophobic perspective. That does not mean that genuine concern about immigration is always motivated by those sins, right? I mean, like it is, as far as I can tell, it is only sane to want a defensible border, right? And to want to know who's coming into the country and to want to be able to admit the people into the country who you want into the country, and so, like, why not have a policy that allows for that? Well, on the left, you begin to sound like a racist asshole arguing for a policy like that. But
Yeah.
again, it's not even highlighted at the level of the Democratic debates. I mean, virtually every candidate had a either explicit or implicit open borders policy.
Oh,
Now, I'm
see, I
sure.
didn't see that at all. That's interesting that I did not, I actually couldn't identify a single candidate that had an effective open borders policy.
Well, it was I mean, they got to the punchline when asked, what do you do with respect to medical care for people who get in, and um, and it was. I mean, again, this is to some degree just a response to the emergency of Trump, right? I mean, we've got kids being put in cages at the border, and now our debate about immigration is being held in that context.
Yeah.
But it seemed to be that we were going to give lifetime free medical care to anyone who could just get into the country, or take reparations. Right now reparations for slavery is not something I've thought much about. I think my bias is certainly that it's worth thinking about and may in fact be the right thing. And
Yes.
I'm not quite sure what the form is. I mean, how you do it, but and may, and I would not be at all surprised that if I thought more about it, and if I had more, if I had a conversation with people who had better ideas about it than I've currently heard, that I could be convinced that not only would it be acceptable, but just it would be a moral necessity to do it, right? So I'm totally open-minded on the reparations issue, but talk about another way to lose to Trump, right? I mean, let's wait 2 years before we have this conversation. So I mean, there's so many threads here that intersect in this same space, and it comes down to, I mean, on one level, on that particular point, it's a lack of political pragmatism, but
Right.
um, which I don't think we should ever lose sight of. I mean, certainly not a year before an election where Trump is on the menu, but it again, it goes to, like, we're just not in a position to have open-ended conversations with a basic principle of charity, uh, keeping everyone at the table, where you're going to assume that the other person has a point of view that's worth taking seriously based on the reasons they can adduce for their having it, right? And not based on the color of their skin or, their and some accident of birth, but just based on a universalizable principle of rationality, which is we just have to keep talking and examining the world and keep course correcting. I mean, this is an iterative process where the best idea ultimately wins. And to actually play this game, it doesn't matter who you are, right? And it doesn't matter on some level. This is definitely not an appeal to authority either. I mean, obviously if you want opinions about history, you tend to go to historians. If you want opinions about neurology, you tend to go to neurologists. But on some more fundamental level, it's about the ideas themselves and their fitness and their degree of fit to the facts as we know them. And when you're really playing that game, you're only as good as your last sentence, right? I mean, it doesn't matter if you have a Nobel Prize in the relevant area. If you say something that doesn't make sense, you get immediate pushback, even from an undergraduate. And that's the way the game is played. But at no point in that process does it matter, that you're gay or trans or tall or short or black or white. I mean, it's like we have to get to a place where referencing any of those variables uh, is just as absurd as referencing tall or short or the color of a person's hair, right? Why don't we have more blondes working at Google, right? What we really need is a blonde candidate for this office.
Well, I think that it's not an apples to apples comparison because blonde is not a historically oppressed group, or I mean, I think that just to pick any characteristic and equate it is not totally precise.
Well, no, but I'm imagining what success looks like. Yes, of
Yes.
course, there's a history of oppression that, again, just coming back to reparations, I'm
Yeah.
I'm open-minded on that topic. But what would a hard reset actually look like? What would a sane civil society look like? Then it would really be just hair color as far as the eye can see, right? It would not be, listen, as a person of color who has suffered this litany of injustices, I can say X, Y, and Z, but you can't say any of those things as a white guy. Uh, I mean, if we're talking about reality, if we're
Yes.
talking about things that scale, if we're talking about how whole societies should function, you know, i- identity politics can't be the algorithm. It just can't. I mean, it's just a narrow form of tribalism that can't possibly get at anything universal. And and again, it energizes its antithesis. I mean, in this case, it energizes white identity politics, which is the most absurd form of tribalism on offer. And it's in full bloom right now in our society, apparently.